Though some aspects of a soldier's life during the pike and shot age might have been more communal, others were undeniably harsh. Enlisting in the army meant more than just signing a contract. It meant embarking on a grueling march. The journey itself, a struggle before even stepping foot on the battlefield. Many didn't survive the march, let alone the war, but there was a glimmer of hope, something to keep the soldiers moving forward, the promise of camp life. It was here, amidst the hardships, that they could find small luxuries, camaraderie, and fleeting comforts. Over time, this camp life shifted and changed, shaped by different regions and eras. But in this film, we focus on how it would have looked in the first half of the 16th century. We'll mostly refer to the Spanish army and the infamous German mercenaries, the Landsknechts. The early modern European field camp, despite its apparent chaos, reveals much about the true nature of a soldier's life in this age. Although combat units were steeped in strict hierarchies, once they set foot in camp, the order seemed to fade. In a Landsknechts regiment, any form of control beyond the bare minimum needed to maintain order was often seen as more of a hindrance than a help. In these camps, physical violence was not only tolerated, it was expected. Generals of the time pushed their soldiers to be tough, aggressive, almost savage. But perhaps the most defining characteristic of the Landsknechts wasn't just their hardened exterior. It was their sense of independence, their rebellious spirit. They weren't just soldiers by command, they were soldiers by choice. Many of them had joined because they wanted to break free from the rigidity of society and escape the routines of their everyday lives. Some were criminals, men running from their pasts, seeking a fresh start. For them, becoming a mercenary was the ultimate escape, a chance to start over. This free-spirited, almost anarchic attitude was the lifeblood of the Landsknechts. Reinhard Baumann, a noted historian on the subject, emphasizes that many of these men were driven by the thrill of adventure, by the freedom that came with choosing their own fate. It wasn't just war. They were living a life unlike any other, constantly on the move, and with little concern for the rigid structures that defined the rest of society. In the Landsknechts, that rebellious energy was impossible to ignore. The Landsknechts weren't just soldiers, they were walking statements of rebellion, each one dressed in as many fabrics and colors as they could manage. Floppy hats adorned with plumes and feathers, puffed sleeves that billowed like sails, and pants in every hue of the rainbow, sometimes even with one leg striped. This was the Landsknecht in full regalia, bold, eccentric, and utterly free-spirited. Their appearance alone was a testament to their defiance of convention. But even amidst the chaos, camp life without some semblance of order was unthinkable. Someone had to ensure that the rules, however loosely defined, were followed. Enter the provost marshal. His role, although known by different names in different armies, was critical in maintaining whatever order there was in the camp. One of his most important duties was overseeing the camp market, a place teeming with merchants selling everything from basic necessities to bizarre and exotic animals. These markets were more than a convenience. They were a lifeline. The states that hired these soldiers could barely provide for the basics of daily life, so anything beyond that had to be acquired by the men themselves. The provost marshal's power extended beyond simply overseeing these transactions. He set the prices for goods and services, everything from clothes to rare delicacies, from alcohol to companionship and even gambling. His decisions depended on the whims of the colonel, his own sense of fairness, or lack thereof, and the articles of war, a collection of rules agreed upon when the men mustered. Usually, the provost would turn a blind eye to the soldiers' indulgences, for he took a cut from every deal. But while the market may have offered some brief moments of pleasure, life in camp wasn't always so carefree. Take, for instance, the grim portrayal of war in German playwright Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage. In his drama, Brecht paints a heartbreaking picture of a woman enduring the horrors of the 30 Years' War, witnessing the loss of her children and struggling alone, dragging her cart through the mud. While Brecht's story is fictional, the realities of the 30 Years' War were devastating. Entire districts were ravaged, with some losing up to 70% of their populations. The dark and tragic events of the 30 Years' War have come to symbolize the brutal side of early modern warfare, where survival often meant losing everything. Life in the early period of warfare, though harsh and sometimes unjust, was not always as grim as we might imagine. It wasn't all suffering and hardship. There was room to make a fair living. Traders, sutlers, and camp followers could find decent business following the army. But merchants weren't the only ones who moved with the regiments. Women and children often followed too, with some even braving the dangers of battle alongside the men. Take a look at the artwork titled The Baggage Train, or Der Tross in German, created in 1518. This striking image is part of a 54-meter-long sequence of woodcuts by Albrecht Altdorfer, part of the triumphal procession of Emperor Maximilian. The baggage train depicted here reveals the sheer diversity of people who followed the army. It wasn't just merchants and ladies of the night. It also included the destitute, the homeless, and orphaned children. Reinhard Baumann, an expert on the Landsknechts, describes the baggage train as essential. It catered to and supplied the mercenaries, offered a marketplace for buying and selling, provided a place for leisure activities, emergency medical services, and even some military functions. It was a vital lifeline, delivering a steady stream of new recruits. From a soldier's perspective, these camp followers were crucial, not just for their goods, but for their support. For example, the wealthier Landsknechts, those who earned double pay, known as Doppelsöldner, could afford comforts that mimicked their life back home. They brought large tents, beds, wall hangings, and cooking equipment into the field, expecting to recreate the familiar comforts of their villages. All of this required someone to manage and care for it, and that was usually the job of women. Even the less affluent soldiers brought at least the basics to the battlefield: a caregiver, someone to look after their gear, and someone to care for them when they were ill or injured. The unit itself didn't provide these personal services, which made these camp followers an integral part of their survival. In the Spanish army, for example, there were the camaraderie, a kind of surrogate family. These small groups of warriors shared living spaces, divided spoils, and looked out for one another in battle and brawls. In a sense, they became each other's successors, forming bonds that went far beyond mere comradeship. The relationship among soldiers and their camp followers was often one of necessity, but also of deep connection, forming an essential part of the fabric of army life. In these makeshift homes, the troops were often accompanied by a few women who fulfilled crucial roles: cooking, caring for the soldiers' gear, and safeguarding their possessions when they were away. These women along with the soldiers, formed a tight-knit community, and while most camp members looked for romantic partners elsewhere, it wasn't uncommon for lasting relationships to develop within these temporary families. In some cases, marriages would bloom from the very heart of this makeshift society. For women, life in this world offered a measure of security, though it was fragile. If a woman lived only with one man and he died, she would face the lonely and perilous journey back home, alone. Alternatively, she could turn to sex for money to survive. Many of the women in the camps at some point became what were known as ladies of the night. It was a harsh reality, but it was also a business, and the soldiers had their own beliefs. The soldiers' credo, "Whores make the best wives," reflected the way they often found their partners. Despite the early modern period being considered deeply devout, selling sex in a camp was not as stigmatized as one might expect. As historians Dennis Showalter and William Astora note, by comparison to later centuries, a woman seems to have lost relatively little status by periodically earning her living commercially, a euphemism for being a whore. But a woman's role in camp life went beyond the domestic sphere. Supported by children, they were often in charge of cleaning the latrines and taking care of the animals. Boys and young men also had their roles, typically serving officers in menial tasks. The luckier boys, however, were given the title of sons of guns, helping in the artillery train where they came under the protection of the gunners. Some of them might even go on to become artillery soldiers themselves one day. Despite the advancements in weaponry, 16th century warfare still relied heavily on field entrenchments, and soldiers despised the back-breaking work of digging and building palisades, so this task was often handed over to women and children. Boys and girls alike would toil in the dirt, constructing these fortifications. It wasn't until the 17th century that soldiers had to take on this work themselves. The legendary leader, Maurice of Orange, who commanded troops during the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Netherlands, found a way to motivate his men. He made the work into a competition, pitting soldiers from different regions, Germans versus the Dutch, for example, against each other in a race to finish the job. Women and children rarely followed the regiment by choice. Many were alone without a support system. Some were driven by the shame of an illegitimate pregnancy, others by the refusal to marry a parent-chosen husband, or perhaps they were simply victims of poverty, where joining the regiment became their only means of survival. During the 30 Years' War, the conditions in which women lived in camp were truly horrific. It is often said that they were little more than the soldiers' property. But this view does not necessarily apply with the same harshness to other early modern conflicts. The 30 Years' War, however, was one of the most brutal periods for civilians, a war that devastated entire populations. For both camp followers and soldiers, the cost of war was unbearable. Illness and injuries were constant companions. Soldiers' bodies were battered and their spirits drained by the agony of battle. Regimental surgeons, often working under miserable conditions, set up their tents on the market to offer medical assistance. They treated everyday ailments, blisters, toothaches, stomach problems, but their real specialty was dealing with the horrific trauma of battle. The field surgeon's role was to save what could be saved, to extract bullets, splinters, and shrapnel from the wounded, often those injured by the deadly force of cannonballs. Even before the explosive shells of later centuries, cannonballs caused devastating damage, splintering stone and wood into deadly fragments. The wounds inflicted by black powder firearms were savage, often leaving no choice but to amputate limbs in an attempt to save a soldier's life. But the process was gruesome. The only anesthetic was alcohol, if it was used at all. Many surgeons believed that keeping the patient conscious gave him a better chance of survival. However, even in the darkest moments of these procedures, the treatment itself was brutal. Cauterizing a wound with hot oil or metal often pushed the soldier into unconsciousness from the sheer agony. But amidst this grim reality, there was a small flicker of hope. The thriving market for artificial limbs, sometimes surprisingly intricate and even luxurious, suggests that many soldiers survived the amputations and endured the painful rehabilitation. It also indicates that the psychological trauma of these surgeries didn't entirely diminish concern for personal appearance and dignity. In this turbulent time, medicine didn't stand still. Advances were made, sometimes by chance. One notable example is the French surgeon Ambroise Paré, who is often credited with improving the treatment of bullet wounds, an achievement that came about almost accidentally, but one that would eventually change the course of battlefield medicine. At one point, the surgeon ran out of hot oils for cauterizing wounds. He noticed something remarkable. The soldiers who had not undergone the brutal treatment seemed to experience less pain and inflammation. Word spread and peasant women suggested that wounds might heal better if left exposed and gently wrapped. This insight would become one of the many small advancements in battlefield medicine. However, the role of the doctors and their teams extended beyond just tending to the wounded. They were also in charge of group sanitation. While the germ theory was unknown, even the most untrained eye could see that neglecting latrine hygiene was a recipe for disaster. Persistent violators of these hygiene protocols were often tossed into the latrine pits themselves, forcing them to find their own way out. A brutal lesson in the importance of cleanliness. Yet, personal hygiene for the soldiers was likely far from ideal. It's no surprise that a good portion of a Landsknecht's hard-earned pay went towards fragrances and pomades to mask the effects of life in the field. Life in the camp was grueling for everyone, soldiers, women, and children alike. Yet, the shadow of the horrific events during the 30 Years' War often obscures the quieter moments when soldiers and camp followers would simply sit around the campfire sharing stories and warmth. For those fleeting moments, life wasn't so bad, at least for the time being. As we explore the lives of soldiers, we find a refreshing break from the darker, more gruesome topics we often cover. This series has been fascinating to create, and we're excited to continue sharing these stories with you. If you're interested in further episodes, there is so much more to uncover.